Section 4 of Kazan by James Oliver Curwood. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Leonard Wilson. Chapter 4. Free from Bonds. There was a low moaning of the wind in the spruce tops as Kazan slunk off into the blackness and mystery of the forest. For hours he lay near the camp, his red and blistered eyes gazing steadily at the tent wherein the terrible thing had happened a little while before. He knew now what death was. He could tell it farther than man. He could smell it in the air, and he knew that there was death all about him, and that he was the cause of it. He lay on his belly in the deep snow and shivered, and the three-quarters of him that was dog whined in a grief-stricken way, while the quarter that was wolf still revealed itself menacingly in his fangs and in the vengeful glare of his eyes. 3 times the man, his master, came out of the tent and shouted loudly, "Kazan! Kazan! Kazan!" 3 times the woman came with him. In the firelight Kazan could see her shining hair streaming about her, as he had seen it in the tent when he had leaped up and killed the other man. In her blue eyes there was the same wild terror, and her face was white as the snow. And the second and third time she too called, "Kazan! Kazan! Kazan!" And all that part of him that was dog and not wolf trembled joyously at the sound of her voice, and he almost crept in to take his beating. But fear of the club was the greater, and he held back hour after hour, until now it was silent again in the tent, and he could no longer see their shadows, and the fire was dying down. Cautiously he crept out from the thick gloom, working his way on his belly toward the packed sledge and what remained of the burned logs. Beyond that sledge, hidden in the darkness of the trees, was the body of the man he had killed, covered with a blanket. Thorpe, his master, had dragged it there. He lay down with his nose to the warm coals, and his eyes leveled between his forepaws straight at the closed tent flap. He meant to keep awake, to watch, to be ready to slink off into the forest at the first movement there. But a warmth was rising from out of the gray ash of the fire-bed, and his eyes closed. 3 times, he fought himself back into watchfulness, but the last time his eyes came only half open and closed heavily again. And now in his sleep he whined softly, and the splendid muscles of his legs and shoulders twitched, and sudden shuddering ripples ran along his tawny spine. Thorpe, who was in the tent, if he had seen him, would have known that he was dreaming. And Thorpe's wife, whose golden head lay close against his breast, and who shuddered and trembled now and then, even as Kazan was doing, would have known what he was dreaming about. In his sleep he was leaping again at the end of his chain. His jaws snapped like castanets of steel, and the sound awakened him, and he sprang to his feet, his spine as stiff as a brush, and his snarling fangs bared like ivory knives. He had awakened just in time. There was movement in the tent. His master was awake, and if he did not escape... He sped swiftly into the thick spruce and paused, flat and hidden, with only his head showing from behind a tree. He knew that his master would not spare him. 3 times Thorpe had beaten him for snapping at McCready. The last time he would have shot him if the girl had not saved him. And now he had torn McCready's throat. He had taken the life from him, and his master would not spare him. Even the woman could not save him. Kazan was sorry that his master had returned, dazed and bleeding, after he had torn McCready's jugular. Then he would have had her always. She would have loved him. She did love him. And he would have followed her and fought for her always, and died for her when the time came. But Thorpe had come in from the forest again, and Kazan had slunk away quickly, for Thorpe meant to him what all men meant to him now, the club, the whip, and the strange things that spat fire and death, And now Thorpe had come out from the tent. It was approaching dawn, and in his hand he held a rifle. A moment later the girl came out, and her hand caught the man's arm. They looked toward the thing covered by the blanket. Then she spoke to Thorpe, and he suddenly straightened and threw back his head. "Hoo! Kazan! Kazan! Kazan!" he called. A shiver ran through Kazan. The man was trying to inveigle him back. He had in his hand the thing that killed. "Kazan! Kazan! Kazan!" he shouted again. Kazan sneaked cautiously back from the tree. He knew that distance meant nothing to the cold thing of death that Thorpe held in his hand. He turned his head once and whined softly, and for an instant a great longing filled his reddened eyes as he saw the last of the girl. He knew now that he was leaving her forever, and there was an ache in his heart that had never been there before, a pain that was not of the club or whip, of cold or hunger, but which was greater than them all, and which filled him with a desire to throw back his head and cry out his loneliness to the gray emptiness of the sky. Back in the camp the girl's voice quivered. "He is gone." The man's strong voice choked a little. "Yes, he is gone. He knew, and I didn't. I'd give a year of my life if I hadn't whipped him yesterday and last night. He won't come back." Isabel Thorpe's hand tightened on his arm. "He will," she cried. "He won't leave me. He loved me, if he was savage and terrible. And he knows that I love him. He'll come back. Listen." From deep in the forest there came a long, wailing howl filled with a plaintive sadness. It was Kazan's farewell to the woman. After that cry Kazan sat for a long time on his haunches, sniffing the new freedom of the air, and watching the deep black pits in the forest about him as they faded away before dawn. Now and then, since the day the traders had first bought him and put him into sledge traces away over on the Mackenzie, he had often thought of this freedom longingly, the wolf blood in him urging him to take it. But he had never quite dared. It thrilled him now. There were no clubs here, no whips, none of the man-beasts whom he had first learned to distrust and then to hate. It was his misfortune, that quarter strain of wolf, and the clubs, instead of subduing him, had added to the savagery that was born in him. Men had been his worst enemies. They had beaten him time and again, until he was almost dead. They called him bad, and stepped wide of him, and never missed the chance to snap a whip over his back. His body was covered with scars they had given him. He had never felt kindness or love until the first night the woman had put her warm little hand on his head, and had snuggled her face close down to his, while Thorpe, her husband, had cried out in horror. He had almost buried his fangs in her white flesh, but in an instant her gentle touch and her sweet voice had sent through him that wonderful thrill that was his first knowledge of love. And now it was a man who was driving him from her, away from the hand that had never held a club or a whip, and he growled as he trotted deeper into the forest. He came to the edge of a swamp as day broke. For a time he had been filled with a strange uneasiness, and light did not quite dispel it. At last he was free of men. He could detect nothing that reminded him of their hated presence in the air. But neither could he smell the presence of other dogs, of the sledge, the fire, of companionship and food. And so far back as he could remember, they had always been a part of his life. Here it was very quiet. The swamp lay in a hollow between two ridge mountains, and the spruce and cedar grew low and thick, so thick that there was almost no snow under them, and day was like twilight. Two things he began to miss more than all others, food and company. Both the wolf and the dog that was in him demanded the first, and that part of him that was dog longed for the latter. To both desires the wolf blood that was strong in him rose responsively. It told him that somewhere in this silent world, between the two ridges, there was companionship, and that all he had to do to find it was to sit back on his haunches and cry out his loneliness. More than once something trembled in his deep chest, rose in his throat, and ended there in a whine. It was the wolf howl, not yet quite born. Food came more easily than voice. Toward midday he cornered a big white rabbit under a log and killed it. The warm flesh and blood was better than frozen fish or tallow and bran, and the feast he had gave him confidence. That afternoon he chased many rabbits and killed 2 more. Until now he had never known the delight of pursuing and killing at will, even though he did not eat all he killed. But there was no fight in the rabbits. They died too easily. They were very sweet and tender to eat when he was hungry, but the first thrill of killing them passed away after a time. He wanted something bigger. He no longer slunk along as if he were afraid, or as if he wanted to remain hidden. He held his head up, his back bristled, his tail swung free and bushy like a wolf's. Every hair in his body quivered with the electric energy of life and action. He traveled north and west. It was the call of early days, the days away up on the Mackenzie. The Mackenzie was 1,000 miles away. He came upon many trails in the snow that day, and sniffed the scents left by the hoofs of moose and caribou and the fur-padded feet of a lynx. He followed a fox, and the trail led him to a place shut in by tall spruce, where the snow was beaten down and reddened with blood. There was an owl's head, feathers, wings, and entrails lying here, and he knew that there were other hunters abroad besides himself. Towards evening he came upon tracks in the snow that were very much like his own. They were quite fresh, and there was a warm scent about them that made him whine, and filled him again with that desire to fall back upon his haunches and send forth the wolf cry. This desire grew stronger in him as the shadows of night deepened in the forest. He had traveled all day, but he was not tired. There was something about night, now that there were no men near, that exhilarated him strangely. The wolf blood in him ran swifter and swifter. Tonight it was clear. The sky was filled with stars. The moon rose, and at last he settled back in the snow and turned his head straight up to the spruce tops, and the wolf came out of him in a long, mournful cry, which quivered through the still night for miles. For a long time he sat and listened after that howl. He had found voice, a voice with a strange new note in it, and it gave him still greater confidence. He had expected an answer, but none came. He had traveled in the face of the wind, and as he howled a bull moose crashed through the scrub timber ahead of him, his horns rattling against the trees like the tattoo of a clear birch club as he put distance between himself and that cry. Twice Kazan howled before he went on, and he found joy in the practice of that new note. He came then to the foot of a rough ridge and turned up out of the swamp to the top of it. The stars and the moon were nearer to him there, and on the other side of the ridge he looked down upon a great sweeping plain, with a frozen lake glistening in the moonlight, and a white river leading from it off into timber that was neither so thick nor so black as that in the swamp. And then every muscle in his body grew tense, and his blood leaped. From far off in the plain there came a cry. It was his cry, the wolf cry. His jaws snapped, his white fangs gleamed, and he growled deep in his throat. He wanted to reply, but some strange instinct urged him not to. That instinct of the wild was already becoming master of him. In the air, in the whispering of the spruce tops, in the moon and the stars themselves, there breathed a spirit which told him that what he had heard was the wolf cry, but that it was not the wolf call. The other came an hour later, clear and distinct, that same wailing howl at the beginning, but ending in a staccato of quick, sharp yelps that stirred his blood at once into a fiery excitement that it had never known before. The same instinct told him that this was the call, the hunt cry. It urged him to come quickly. A few moments later it came again, and this time there was a reply from close down along the foot of the ridge, and another from so far away that Kazan could scarcely hear it. The hunt pack was gathering for the night chase, but Kazan sat quiet and trembling. He was not afraid, but he was not ready to go. The ridge seemed to split the world for him. Down there it was new and strange and without men. From the other side something seemed pulling him back, and suddenly he turned his head and gazed back through the moonlit space behind him and whined. It was the dog whine now. The woman was back there. He could hear her voice. He could feel the touch of her soft hand. He could see the laughter in her face and eyes, the laughter that had made him warm and happy. She was calling to him through the forests, and he was torn between desire to answer that call and desire to go down into the plain. For he could also see many men waiting for him with clubs, and he could hear the cracking of whips and feel the sting of their lashes. For a long time he remained on the top of the ridge that divided his world, and then at last he turned and went down into the plain. All that night he kept close to the hunt pack, but never quite approached it. This was fortunate for him. He still bore the scent of traces and of man. The pack would have torn him into pieces. The first instinct of the wild is that of self-preservation. It may have been this, a whisper back through the years of savage forebears, that made Kazan roll in the snow now and then where the feet of the pack had trod the thickest. That night the pack killed a caribou on the edge of the lake, and feasted until nearly dawn. Kazan hung in the face of the wind. The smell of blood and of warm flesh tickled his nostrils, and his sharp ears could catch the cracking of bones. But the instinct was stronger than the temptation. Not until broad day, when the pack had scattered far and wide over the plain, did he go boldly to the scene of the kill. He found nothing but an area of blood-reddened snow, covered with bones, entrails, and torn bits of tough hide. But it was enough, and he rolled in it and buried his nose in what was left, and remained all that day close to it, saturating himself with the scent of it. That night, when the moon and the stars came out again, he sat back with fear and hesitation no longer in him, and announced himself to his new comrades of the great plain. The pack hunted again that night, or else it was a new pack that started miles to the south and came up with a doe caribou to the big frozen lake. The night was almost as clear as day, and from the edge of the forest Kazan first saw the caribou run out on the lake a third of a mile away. The pack was about a dozen strong, and had already split into the fatal horseshoe formation, the two leaders running almost abreast of the kill and slowly closing in. With a sharp yelp, Kazan darted out into the moonlight. He was directly in the path of the fleeing doe, and bore down upon her with lightning speed. 200 yards away the doe saw him, and swerved to the right, and the leader on that side met her with open jaws. Kazan was in with a second leader, and leaped at the doe's soft throat. In a snarling mass the pack closed in from behind, and the doe went down, with Kazan half under her body, his fangs sunk deep in her jugular. She lay heavily on him, but he did not lose his hold. It was his first big kill. His blood ran like fire. He snarled between his clamped teeth. Not until the last quiver had left the body over him did he pull himself out from under her chest and forelegs. He had killed a rabbit that day and was not hungry, so he sat back in the snow and waited, while the ravenous pack tore at the dead doe. After a little he came nearer, nosed in between two of them, and was nipped for his intrusion. As Kazan drew back, still hesitating to mix with his wild brothers, a big gray form leaped out of the pack and drove straight for his throat. He had just time to throw his shoulder to the attack, and for a moment the two rolled over and over in the snow. They were up before the excitement of sudden battle had drawn the pack from the feast. Slowly they circled about each other, their white fangs bare, their yellowish backs bristling like brushes. The fatal ring of wolves drew about the fighters. It was not new to Kazan. A dozen times he had sat in rings like this, waiting for the final moment. More than once he had fought for his life within the circle. It was the sledge-dog way of fighting. Unless man interrupted with a club or a whip, it always ended in death. Only one fighter could come out alive. Sometimes both died. And there was no man here, only that fatal cordon of waiting, white-fanged demons, ready to leap upon and tear to pieces the first of the fighters who was thrown upon his side or back. Kazan was a stranger, but he did not fear those that hemmed him in. The one great law of the pack would compel them to be fair. He kept his eyes only on the big gray leader who had challenged him. Shoulder to shoulder they continued to circle. Where a few moments before there had been the snapping of jaws and the rending of flesh, there was now silence. Soft-footed and soft-throated mongrel dogs from the south would have snarled and growled, but Kazan and the wolf were still, their ears laid forward instead of back, their tails free and bushy. Suddenly the wolf struck in with the swiftness of lightning, and his jaws came together with the sharpness of steel striking steel. They missed by an inch. In that same instant Kazan darted into the side, and like knives his teeth gashed the wolf's flank. They circled again, their eyes growing redder, their lips drawn back until they seemed to have disappeared. And then Kazan leaped for that death grip at the throat, and missed. It was only by an inch again, and the wolf came back as he had done, and laid open Kazan's flank, so that the blood ran down his leg and reddened the snow. The burn of that flank wound told Kazan that his enemy was old in the game of fighting. He crouched low, his head straight out, and his throat close to the snow. It was a trick Kazan had learned in puppyhood, to shield his throat and wait. Twice the wolf circled about him, and Kazan pivoted slowly, his eyes half closed. A second time the wolf leaped, and Kazan threw up his terrible jaws, sure of that fatal grip just in front of the forelegs. His teeth snapped on empty air. With the nimbleness of a cat, the wolf had gone completely over his back. The trick had failed, and with a rumble of the dog snarl in his throat, Kazan reached the wolf in a single bound. They met breast to breast, their fangs clashed, and with the whole weight of his body, Kazan flung himself against the wolf's shoulders, cleared his jaws, and struck again for the throat hold. It was another miss by a hair's breadth. And before he could recover, the wolf's teeth were buried in the back of his neck. For the first time in his life Kazan felt the terror and the pain of the death grip, and with a mighty effort he flung his head a little forward and snapped blindly. His powerful jaws closed on the wolf's foreleg, close to the body. There was a cracking of bone and a crunching of flesh, and the circle of waiting wolves grew tense and alert. One or the other of the fighters was sure to go down before the holds were broken, and they but awaited that fatal fall as a signal to leap into the death. Only the thickness of hair and hide on the back of Kazan's neck, and the toughness of his muscles, saved him from that terrible fate of the vanquished. The wolf's teeth sank deep, but not deep enough to reach the vital spot, and suddenly Kazan put every ounce of strength in his limbs to the effort, and flung himself up bodily from under his antagonist. The grip on his neck relaxed, and with another rearing leap he tore himself free. As swift as a whiplash he whirled on the broken-legged leader of the pack, and with the full rush and weight of his shoulders struck him fairly in the side. More deadly than the throat grip had Kazan sometimes found the lunge when delivered at the right moment. It was deadly now. The big gray wolf lost his feet, rolled upon his back for an instant, and the pack rushed in, eager to rend the last of life from the leader whose power had ceased to exist. From out of that gray, snarling, bloody-lipped mass, Kazan drew back, panting and bleeding. He was weak. There was a curious sickness in his head. He wanted to lie down in the snow, but the old and infallible instinct warned him not to betray that weakness. From out of the pack a slim, lithe, gray she-wolf came up to him, and lay down in the snow before him, and then rose swiftly and sniffed at his wounds. She was young and strong and beautiful, but Kazan did not look at her. Where the fight had been he was looking, at what little remained of the old leader. The pack had returned to the feast. He heard again the cracking of bones and the rending of flesh, and something told him that hereafter all the wilderness would hear and recognize his voice, and that when he sat back on his haunches and called to the moon and the stars, those swift-footed hunters of the big plain would respond to it. He circled twice about the caribou and the pack, and then trotted off to the edge of the black spruce forest. When he reached the shadows he looked back. Gray Wolf was following him. She was only a few yards behind, and now she came up to him a little timidly, and she too looked back to the dark blotch of life out on the lake. And as she stood there close beside him, Kazan sniffed at something in the air that was not the scent of blood, nor the perfume of the balsam and spruce. It was a thing that seemed to come to him from the clear stars, the cloudless moon, the strange and beautiful quiet of the night itself, and its presence seemed to be a part of Gray Wolf. He looked at her, and he found Gray Wolf's eyes alert and questioning. She was young, so young that she seemed scarcely to have passed out of puppyhood. Her body was strong and slim and beautifully shaped. In the moonlight the hair under her throat and along her back shone sleek and soft. She whined at the red staring light in Kazan's eyes, and it was not a puppy's whimper. Kazan moved toward her and stood with his head over her back, facing the pack. He felt her trembling against his chest. He looked at the moon and the stars again, the mystery of Gray Wolf and of the night throbbing in his blood. Not much of his life had been spent at the posts. Most of it had been on the trail, in the traces, and the spirit of the mating season had only stirred him from afar. But it was very near now. Gray Wolf lifted her head. Her soft muzzle touched the wound on his neck, and in the gentleness of that touch, in the low sound in her throat, Kazan felt and heard again that wonderful something that had come with the caress of the woman's hand and the sound of her voice. He turned, whining, his back bristling, his head high and defiant of the wilderness which he faced. Gray Wolf trotted close at his side as they entered into the gloom of the forest. End of Chapter 4 of Kazan by James Oliver Curwood. Recording by Leonard Wilson of Springfield, Ohio.